these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
SITREP 14, welcome. Thanks for joining us as we cover the most interesting news from last week and arm you with the facts, just the facts. So first on our list is the U.S.-Ukraine critical mineral deal being finalized. Last Wednesday, the United States and Ukraine finally signed an agreement creating a joint investment fund to finance the European country's reconstruction using future revenues from oil, gas, and critical mineral projects. The U.S. will be able to negotiate purchases of these resources at market rates. While no formal security guarantees were included, the deal ties U.S. economic and military support to Ukraine's long-term recovery. This is a stronger stance against Russia than earlier drafts of the deal. It's called the United States-Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund. The details of the agreement stipulate that the U.S. is required to negotiate resource purchases directly from these projects, and Ukraine must avoid granting better deals to other buyers unless they also offer the same terms to the joint fund. Ukraine will contribute 50% of royalties from new resource projects while retaining full ownership of its resources. Additionally, any future U.S. military assistance will be counted as capital contributions to the U.S.-Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund, and Ukraine will not be required to repay previous U.S. aid. Shortly after the signing, President Trump approved $50 million in defense exports to Ukraine. The agreement reflects President Trump's investment for resources approach, balancing U.S. aid with access to Ukrainian resources. I would also call this an America First approach. This is very typical of how President Trump looks at things, and I think it's a good idea. It highlights the growing importance also of critical minerals in U.S. foreign policy. It also serves as a model for future agreements, like, say, ongoing talks with the Democratic Republic of Congo. Also worth noting, President Trump recently put out an executive order on critical minerals. So the administration is taking the entire subject of critical minerals very seriously. Also going on in the world, a brewing conflict between India and Pakistan. Hostilities between India and Pakistan continue to escalate despite diplomatic efforts. Now, yesterday, India launched airstrikes against 9 targets in Pakistan, retaliating against a deadly militant attack in Kashmir that we covered last week. Now, after those attacks, Pakistan reported 8 deaths and 35 injuries, claimed to have shot down 5 Indian aircraft. The risk of broader confrontation between these two nuclear powers is definitely increasing. India described the targets of its recent strikes as terrorist infrastructure used to plan and coordinate last week's attacks in Kashmir, emphasizing that no Pakistani military facilities were hit. Nevertheless, Pakistan's Prime Minister, Shehbaz Sharif, condemned the strikes as an act of war and vowed a strong response. These strikes represent India's most significant military action against Pakistan since the 1971 war. So far, despite efforts by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to de-escalate the tensions, the situation remains pretty severe, the most in decades. Now, remember, following last week's attack in Kashmir, which killed 26 tourists, India intensified its security operations by demolishing homes of suspected militants, detaining hundreds of individuals, suspending the Indus Waters Treaty, closing its airspace to Pakistani flights, expelling diplomats, and ordering Pakistani nationals to leave. Pakistan retaliated by closing its own airspace, detaining an Indian border guard who inadvertently crossed the boundary. So the situation is obviously ongoing and carries a significant risk of unintended consequences and miscalculations, and we'll be continuing to monitor it closely. On to Israel. Israel moves to expand the Gaza offensive. So this week, Israel's security cabinet approved a decisive plan to end the war in Gaza, repatriate the remaining hostages, and eliminate Hamas's terrorist infrastructure permanently. It's called Gideon's Chariots. The new strategy involves seizing complete control of Gaza, relocating civilians from northern to southern Gaza, and maintaining an indefinite military presence, likely to coincide with the conclusion of President Trump's trip to the Middle East next week. So Israel plans to hold territory to prevent Hamas regrouping and plans to mobilize thousands of reservists for expanded ground operations. Civilians and humanitarian aid will be moved from north to south through 6 to 10 distribution sites guarded by private U.S. security contractors, and via the Kerem Shalom crossing, a key access point at the junction of the Gaza Strip, Israel, and Egypt. Hamas will be barred from involvement in aid distribution to prevent it from diverting supplies for its war effort. As I mentioned, the goal of the plan is to prevent Hamas from reconstituting its infrastructure or power over the territory. As of now, 59 hostages remain in Hamas custody, though only 24 are believed to be alive. International humanitarian groups have rejected Israel's aid distribution plan, citing concerns over civilian risk and violations of neutrality. Aid shortages in Gaza remain severe, with widespread malnutrition and looting reported. So needless to say, the peace plan didn't work. Back here in the United States on domestic news, news for student loan borrowers specifically. On Monday, May 5th, President Trump ended the 5-year pause on student loan collections, affecting approximately 5 million borrowers in default who must now resume their payments. Now, this marks a return to financial accountability after 5 years of federally subsidized loan delinquency. I would call that taxpayer-subsidized loan delinquency for people who got to use those loans on their education and investment in themselves. That's, again, the argument that we make here. Remember, at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Biden administration paused student loan collections for over 5 million borrowers. That pause officially ended in 2023, and then they extended it, a no-consequences period, through the 2024 election for those who chose not to pay. President Trump's Department of Education has resumed those collections. For borrowers who continue to refuse payment, the Treasury Department will begin sending notices for wage garnishment and tax refund offsets starting this summer. I want to be clear, borrowers still have multiple options available to address their default status before facing these consequences. There's loan rehabilitation, there's loan consolidation, income-driven repayment plans. All of those are accessible for those needing assistance. Now let's talk about Alcatraz. President Trump has announced plans to rebuild and reopen Alcatraz as a federal prison, calling it a bold symbol of law, order, and justice. Despite predictable pushback from San Francisco officials and the media, the Bureau of Prisons has begun assessing the feasibility of the plan and Alcatraz's potential to house the nation's most dangerous repeat offenders. At the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has ordered a 20% reduction in the number of 4-star generals and admirals, as well as a 10% reduction of all flag officers in the military. This initiative aims to cut excess bureaucracy in leadership positions, shifting focus towards enhancing combat readiness and building effective warfighters. Secretary Hegseth argues that these reductions are necessary to streamline leadership by eliminating unnecessary positions, emphasizing that more generals and admirals do not equal more success. Clarify that the cuts will be part of a deliberate strategic process, not a sudden or reckless action. So 20% is a goal, but will be done surgically. Specifically, it would decrease the current count of 37 4-star officers to about 30. A 10% cut to all flag officers would reduce their numbers from about 900 to 800. Now, some might argue cutting the number of generals or admirals will decrease the force's readiness. However, the concept of trimming top-heavy military leadership isn't new. Former Defense Secretary Robert Gates, who served under both Presidents Bush and Obama, previously identified excessive layers of leadership as bureaucratic obstacles to efficiency and proposed similar cuts to flag officers. It's also important to consider that reducing high-level military positions also affects associated support staff and funding. A GAO study conducted during Gates' efficiency initiative found that from 2001 to 2012, support staff at combatant commands headquarters grew by roughly 50%. I can say from my own experience, yes, there's a lot of flag officers, and especially if you're running around the Pentagon, it seems like everybody is, and perhaps is unnecessary. On to the Supreme Court. So yesterday, the Supreme Court removed a lower court's order that paused President Trump's transgender military ban from taking effect. Okay, what does that mean in non-legal speak? It means that President Trump's ban can take effect. Now, on January 27th, President Trump issued an executive order banning transgender individuals from military service. The order required the Department of Defense to revise medical standards concerning transgender individuals and rescind guidelines inconsistent with military readiness. Subsequently, 7 transgender service members challenged this executive order in federal district courts in Seattle and Washington, D.C. That resulted in an injunction that temporarily blocked the administration from implementing the ban and removing the transgender service members. The government appealed, asserting that the policy advances critical interests in military readiness, unit cohesion, maintaining order and discipline, and controlling costs. Of course, I agree with all of these. I've made this point various times on various podcasts that we've done. A 3-judge panel appointed by Presidents Clinton, Obama, and Biden initially denied the appeal. However, the Supreme Court ultimately lifted the injunction on Tuesday in a 6-3 decision, which permits the policy to take effect. Now, some critics argue the order denies individuals their right to serve. However, let's just clarify that there is no inherent right to serve in the military, as enlistment can be denied due to a whole number of reasons: medical, psychological, like asthma, diabetes, hearing impairments. Heck, I've heard of people just getting turned away because of flat feet. Now, the core purpose of the military is lethality and victory in warfare. It's not conducting social experiments or funding gender reassignment surgeries that render service members non-deployable, and that's exactly what they would do, despite all of the arguments from the left. These are major either surgeries or hormone therapies that fundamentally require a lot of additional medical care and fundamentally make you undeployable. If I'm undeployable because of my one eye, well, what happens to somebody who's completely changed their entire gender? Now, in other developing headlines, there's a lot of other relevant news. Since President Trump began his second term, I, like you, have struggled to keep up with the breadth of headlines. Now, we can't cover them all on the SITREP, so I just want to give you a few developing stories that we're following and that you should know about. Number one, the UN might soon run out of money. On Monday, the UN announced it's facing a severe financial crisis with key operations at risk due to a shortfall in member contributions, especially from the U.S. Number two, MAGA media muscles up. Conservative media outlets are expanding their influence ahead of the 2026 election, aiming to counter mainstream coverage. Three, evidence for pediatric gender transitions very low, says U.S. government report. A new federal report finds minimal scientific evidence supporting gender transitions in minors, prompting a renewed debate over medical guidelines. I've been fighting that battle for many years, as you know. Also, Education Secretary McMahon says Harvard is no longer eligible for new federal research grants. The Trump administration has suspended new federal research grants to Harvard, citing concerns over anti-Semitism, discriminatory admissions practices, and a lack of ideological diversity. Harvard argues the move infringes on academic freedom and has filed a lawsuit challenging the administration's actions. Also, President Trump's planned Hollywood tariff rattles studios and streamers. The president has proposed a 100% tariff on all foreign-made films, aiming to revitalize the U.S. movie industry by countering overseas incentives that attract American productions. He labeled the influx of foreign films as a national security threat and a form of propaganda. And back in Israel, Israel is unleashing on Yemen's airport power plants in powerful show of force. On Monday, Yemen's Houthi militants launched a missile at Israel, striking near Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion airport. Israel responded by striking Sana'a International Airport and several power plants in Yemen's capital, alleging that all were being used by the Houthis. And of course, last but not least, the Cardinals begin conclave to elect new pope in the majesty of the Sistine Chapel. We did a whole podcast detailing how that will go, so be sure to read it. A good read if you read nothing else. It's 80 years after VE Day, and that's Victory in Europe Day. That's when the Germany surrendered. The article is in Providence Magazine. It's called 80 Years After VE Day. We remember that victory is rooted in virtue. It's a good read. That's all for today. Thanks.